In the autumn of 1947, on the wind-scoured plains of eastern Montana, a woman named Elara Vance began doing something that made no sense. She had bought a surplus military Quonset hut, a long, arched tube of corrugated steel, and had it erected on a concrete slab in the middle of her late husband's quarter section. This alone was unusual, but it was what she did next that turned curiosity into outright mockery. She hired a man with a small tractor and scraper, and for 2 weeks they piled dirt against its sides. Not just a little dirt for banking, but tons of it. A mountain of dark prairie soil rose up, burying the steel arch until only the south-facing front and a strange tall pipe sticking out of the top were visible. Travelers on the county road would slow their trucks. Neighbors would stop and stare from their fence lines. They saw a war widow, barely 30 years old, directing the creation of what looked like an enormous grave. By the time November's first snows dusted the plains, her home had become a smooth, earthen mound, an unnatural hill on the flat landscape. The locals gave it a name. They called it Vance's Folly. Some, more cruelly, called it the dirt roof coffin. It was a joke told over coffee at the general store, a cautionary tale about what grief and isolation could do to a person's mind. What did this quiet woman, a stranger to this land with only her young son for company, understand about the physics of survival that every seasoned rancher and builder in the territory had missed? What secret was buried beneath that silent mound of earth? The answer would not come in words, but in a wave of cold so profound it would threaten to break them all. If you believe that sometimes the most radical ideas come from the quietest corners, subscribe to this channel for more stories of forgotten wisdom. And drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We read every single one. The problem in that part of Montana was not simply the cold, it was the totality of the cold. It was a physical presence, an antagonist that laid siege to their homes from October until April. The wind was its scout, finding every crack in the mortar, every gap in the window frames. The snow was its infantry, piling in drifts that could bury a house to its eaves, and the temperature was its heavy artillery, a relentless barrage of sub-zero bombardments. The post-war years had brought a rush of new families to the territory, eager to claim land and build lives. But they built with the speed of necessity, not the wisdom of experience. They threw up thin-walled frame houses and traditional log cabins, structures that were perfectly adequate in milder climates, but were tragically outmatched here. These homes were thermal sieves. The settlers fought the cold with the only weapon they had: fire. The cast iron stove was the heart of every home, but it was a ravenous, demanding heart. It consumed cords of precious cottonwood and pine at a terrifying rate. A family's winter was measured not in months, but in the size of their woodpile. When the woodpile shrank, fear grew. Inside these cabins, life was a constant battle for warmth. A rime of frost grew on the heads of nails driven through the interior walls, tiny white stars of cold that mapped the structure's skeleton. Blankets on the beds would feel perpetually damp, stiff with a chill that burrowed deep into your bones. Ink froze in its wells. A cup of coffee left on a table far from the stove would develop a skin of ice in minutes. The people accepted this as the price of admission. It was the hardship you endured. They wore coats indoors. They huddled together. They told themselves it was character building. But every winter, the cold took its toll. It took the newborn infants, the elderly, and the unwary. It was a quiet, grinding attrition. Elara Vance had known a different kind of war. Her husband, Captain Thomas Vance, had been an officer with the Army Corps of Engineers. He hadn't fought in the trenches of Europe, but in the frozen, windswept islands of the Aleutians. His war was against the environment. He built airstrips on frozen tundra and command bunkers that could withstand 100-mile-per-hour winds and temperatures that could freeze a man's lungs. Before he was killed in a construction accident, he had filled dozens of notebooks with sketches, calculations, and observations. He wrote to Elara not of battle, but of the elegant physics of survival. He described how the Inuit built with snow, not against it. He detailed the construction of ammunition depots buried in hillsides, structures that maintained a stable, above-freezing temperature year-round with no heating at all. He had taught her to see the earth not as something to be cleared away, but as the ultimate building material, a blanket woven by God. When he was gone, she was left with his pension, his notebooks, and their son, Leo. She chose Montana because the land was cheap and the sky looked like the ones in his letters. But when she saw the local cabins, saw the shivering children and the desperate race to cut enough firewood, she didn't see resilience. She saw a fundamental design flaw. She saw men fighting a war of brute force against an enemy that could only be defeated with intelligence. They were trying to hold back the ocean with a wooden fence. Elara intended to build a submarine. Her work began in August. The foundation was the first sign of her heresy. Instead of a simple concrete slab poured onto the dirt, she had a shallow pit dug and filled with a foot of coarse gravel. Over this, she laid down sheets of thick, military surplus tarred felt, overlapping them meticulously to create a waterproof, vapor-proof barrier. Only then was the concrete poured. The old-timers just shook their heads. It was a waste of time and material. Next came the Quonset hut itself. Assembling the steel arches was straightforward enough, a kit of parts bolted together. It formed a long half-cylinder of a building, 80 feet long and 20 feet wide. It looked flimsy and temporary, a metallic caterpillar on the prairie. Silas Croft, the region's most respected builder, stopped by one afternoon. Silas was a good man. His log cabins were masterpieces of the craft, with tight-fitting joints and sturdy ridgepoles. He had built the church, the Grange Hall, and the homes of the most prosperous ranchers. His approval was a seal of quality. He watched Elara and a hired hand tightening bolts on the steel shell, his brow furrowed with genuine concern. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I don't mean to intrude, but I feel it's my duty to warn you. This thing, it won't work." Elara simply paused, wiped her brow, and looked at him. "Why not, Mr. Croft?" "Steel," he said, tapping a corrugated panel with a thick knuckle. "It's a conductor. In the winter, the cold will come right through this. It'll be colder in here than it is outside, and any heat you make from your stove will hit this cold metal and sweat. Condensation. It'll drip on you day and night. Everything you own will be soaked and ruined. You'll be living in a cave of ice." His argument was sound. It was based on a lifetime of experience with wood and stone. It was the voice of established wisdom. Elara nodded slowly. "I've accounted for that," Silas sighed, frustrated by her calm. He pointed to the sky. "And the snow load? A heavy, wet snow in March could weigh tons. It'll flatten this tin can like you'd step on a bean can. You're building a trap for yourself and that boy." "The structure isn't finished, Mr. Croft," was all she said. He left that day convinced he was dealing with a woman who was not only foolish, but dangerously stubborn. His warnings, meant to be helpful, soon became part of the local lore. The story of Silas Croft trying to talk sense into the widow Vance was retold with knowing chuckles. The next phase of construction only solidified their judgment. Elara began the waterproofing. She and her helper painstakingly coated the entire exterior of the steel hut with hot, black asphalt mastic. Over this, they rolled out more layers of the heavy tarred felt, sealing each seam with more hot tar. The Quonset hut disappeared beneath a seamless, black, waterproof skin. It looked monstrous and alien, Then came the earth. The tractor began its slow work, scraping up the rich topsoil that had been set aside and piling it against the waterproofed shell. Day after day, the mound grew, first 3 feet thick, then 5, then 8 feet over the crown of the arch. The north side, which would face the brutal winter winds, received the thickest blanket, nearly 12 feet of densely packed soil. The south side, the front of the house, was left open, a vertical wall of concrete and glass that would face the low winter sun. The final piece of the puzzle was the most bizarre. 2 wide-diameter steel pipes were installed. One rose from the ground about 50 feet west of the structure, climbing 15 feet into the air, capped with a hooded vent. This pipe then ran underground, buried 6 feet deep, before entering the house through the foundation. The other pipe was shorter, an exhaust flue that vented out through the earthen roof near the back. The community had no frame of reference for this. It was part of the madness. By October, it was done. A green fuzz of hardy prairie grass was already beginning to sprout on the mound. It was no longer Vance's folly. The children had a new name for it. They called it the Hobbit House. The adults just shook their heads and waited for the first big freeze. They expected to see the widow and her boy begging for shelter at a neighbor's door before Christmas. Elara Vance gave them no such satisfaction. She remained quiet, kept to herself, and prepared for winter. She had not built a house. She had built a system, a machine for living, based on principles the plainsman had never considered. The system was an elegant trinity of physics. The first and most obvious principle was insulation. The 8 to 12 feet of earth covering her home provided an immense R value, a measure of thermal resistance. A typical log wall might have an R value of 8. A modern insulated stud wall might be R19. Elara's roof and walls of packed earth had an R value of over 40. It was a fortress against heat loss. The second principle was thermal mass. This was the secret that Silas Croft, with his focus on lightweight wood construction, could not grasp. The tons of earth surrounding the living space acted as a massive thermal battery. In the fall, as the air cooled, the ground retained the summer's warmth. It would take months of sustained cold for the frost to penetrate more than a few feet into that dense mound. The earth didn't just block the cold, it actively stored heat, smoothing out the daily temperature fluctuations into a gentle, slow-moving average. The house wasn't just sitting on the earth, it was coupled to it, drawing on the planet's stable subterranean temperature. But the third principle was the stroke of genius, the part derived from Captain Vance's most advanced bunker designs. It was the ventilation system. The tall intake pipe was the house's lung. When the outside air temperature was 0, the ground 6 feet below the surface remained at a relatively constant temperature, somewhere between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. As the freezing outside air was drawn down the tall pipe and traveled through the 50 feet of buried tube, the surrounding earth acted as a heat exchanger. The frozen air was naturally and passively pre-warmed to nearly 50 degrees before it ever entered the house. It arrived not as an icy draft, but as cool, fresh, preheated air. This eliminated the single greatest source of heat loss in a conventional cabin: cold air infiltration. The small stove inside didn't have to fight 0-degree air. It only had to nudge 50-degree air into comfortable warmth. It was the difference between lifting a bucket and lifting a boulder. That November and December were mild, lulling the territory into a false sense of security. The mockery of Elara's home softened into a kind of pitying indifference. Then January came. It arrived not as a storm, but as a silent, invisible invasion from the north. Meteorologists would later call it an Arctic high-pressure system, a massive dome of dense, frigid air descending from Siberia. To the people of Montana, it had a simpler name: the Great Freeze of 48. The first day, the temperature at dawn was 10 degrees Fahrenheit. By sunset, it was -5. The second day, it never rose above -10. By the third morning, the thermometer outside the general store read -22 degrees, and the wind began to blow. It wasn't a blizzard, not a storm that obscured the sky, but a dry, relentless river of air that felt like it was stripping the very heat from the atoms of the world. Life in the territory ground to a halt. Schools closed. The mail carrier didn't run his route. Ranchers struggled to keep their livestock alive, finding cattle frozen solid in their pastures, standing as if they had simply fallen asleep. The world became small, shrinking to the space around the wood stove. Inside the conventional cabins, the battle was being lost. The constant whining wind drove the cold through every wall. The frost on the nail heads grew into thick, furry blossoms of ice. The windows were opaque white sheets. Families burned through their wood piles with terrifying speed. The rhythmic sound of an axe splitting logs, usually a comforting winter sound, became a frantic, desperate drumbeat. Then, in some homes, it stopped. They had run out. They started burning fence posts, then furniture. Silas Croft was facing his own personal crisis. His cabin, the best-built home for 50 miles, was failing. He had chinked every log himself. He had built a massive stone fireplace that was a model of efficiency. But the cold was overwhelming his craft. He kept the stove roaring, the metal glowing a dull cherry red, yet the far corners of the main room remained below freezing. His wife and 2 young daughters lived in a small circle of blankets around the hearth. The frost was a 1/4 inch thick on the inside of their bedroom walls. He was a master of his trade, a man whose identity was tied to his competence, and his competence was proving useless. He had burned through a week's worth of wood in 2 days. The fear he felt was cold and sharp, a different kind of cold from the one outside. It was the fear of a provider who could no longer provide. And through his fear, a thought kept nagging at him, a vision of the strange earthen mound on the Vance property. He had predicted it would be a cave of ice. He had laughed about it. But what if he was wrong? The thought was a professional humiliation, but it was overshadowed by a deeper, more human dread. What if that woman and her boy were freezing to death, too proud to ask for help after the whole town had mocked them? The guilt was a heavy weight. On the 4th day of the freeze, with the outside temperature at -31, Silas made a decision. He pulled on every layer of clothing he owned, wrapped a scarf over his face until only his eyes were visible, and told his wife he was going to check on the widow Vance. The 2-mile walk was a journey through an alien world. The snow crunched under his boots with a dry, screeching sound he had never heard before. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, a sharp pain deep in his lungs. His eyelashes froze together every time he blinked. The wind was a physical bully, shoving and tearing at him, seeking any sliver of exposed skin. He was a capable, powerful man, and the environment was reducing him to a fragile, struggling creature. It took him nearly an hour to cover the distance a horse could have walked in 20 minutes. He finally saw it, a low white dome in the landscape, the only signs of life a thin curl of smoke from a metal chimney and the tall hooded intake pipe, stark against the pale blue sky. There were no frantic tracks in the snow, no signs of desperation, just a profound and unnerving stillness. He approached the south-facing entrance, a wall with a sturdy wooden door and 2 large windows. The windows were not frosted over. They were clear. He could see a warm yellow light inside. His mind couldn't process it. He must be seeing things. He raised a gloved, trembling hand and knocked on the door. He expected a long wait, the sounds of someone struggling to move in the cold. Instead, the door opened almost immediately. It was not the cold that struck him. It was the warmth. It rolled out of the doorway like a physical wave, a tide of gentle, humid heat that enveloped him. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of an overworked stove. It was a soft, pervasive warmth that seemed to radiate from the very air. He stumbled inside, pulling the door shut behind him, and stood there, utterly stunned. Elara Vance stood before him, wearing a simple cotton dress, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Her son, Leo, was sitting on the wooden floor 50 feet away, playing with a set of wooden blocks. He was in his stocking feet. The air smelled of baking bread and damp earth, a clean, living smell. Silas looked around. The curved interior walls of corrugated steel were painted a clean white. They were cool to the touch, but they were not sweating. There was no frost anywhere, not on the walls, not on the windows. A small cast-iron stove sat in the middle of the room, burning with a calm, steady flame, its firebox door barely cracked open. Silas, the expert builder, felt his entire understanding of the world tilt on its axis. He was an explorer who had just landed in a new country with impossible laws of physics. He took off his thick gloves, his fingers clumsy and numb. He walked, as if in a trance, over to the wall thermometer next to the door. The mercury stood at a steady 47 degrees. He turned to Elara, his voice a hoarse whisper. 47 degrees? She nodded. It stays right about there. A bit warmer near the stove, of course. Silas's mind raced, performing the brutal calculation. It was minus 31 outside. That was a 78-degree temperature differential. To maintain that in his own cabin, he would need a fire that could melt steel. He looked at her stove, at its gentle, lazy fire. Then he looked at her wood box. It was a simple crate, and it was more than 3/4 full. The wood? He stammered, pointing. How much have you burned since this started? Elara glanced at the box. We've been at it for 4 days now. I've probably used 1/4 of what's in that box. I bring in a new load from the shed every week or so. The number landed on Silas Croft like a physical blow. 1/4 of that small box in 4 days. He burned more than that in 4 hours. The efficiency was mathematically impossible. It defied everything he knew. He looked from the calm fire to the barefoot child, to the woman in the simple dress, and the full, crushing weight of his ignorance settled upon him. He had not just been wrong. He had been spectacularly, fundamentally, dangerously wrong. He walked over to the north wall, the wall that faced the wind, the wall that in his own home was a solid sheet of ice. He pressed his bare palm against the cool, painted steel. There was no bone-deep chill. There was no seeping cold. It felt neutral, inert. It felt like victory. He turned back to Elara, and the arrogance and certainty that had defined him were gone, replaced by a profound and humbling awe. He looked her in the eye, and the words came out, heavy with the weight of his conversion. I was wrong, he said. The admission cost his pride everything, and in doing so, it set him free. I was completely, utterly wrong. I came here expecting to find you frozen. Instead, he gestured around the room, at the impossible comfort, the casual normalcy in the face of an Arctic apocalypse. This is the smartest, most sensible thing I have ever seen in my life. He took a step closer, his expression no longer that of a concerned neighbor, but of an eager apprentice. Ma'am, he said, his voice thick with emotion, will you teach me? Will you show me how you did this? When the great freeze finally broke a week later, the stories began to trickle out. Stories of loss and hardship, of livestock lost and families pushed to their limits. But another story began to circulate as well. A story told first by a humbled Silas Croft. It was the story of the warm mound. He brought people to see it. First the other builders, his friendly rivals. They arrived as skeptics and left as converts. They put their hands on the walls. They felt the gentle warmth. They saw the small woodpile. They listened as Elara, using her late husband's simple, clear language, explained the principles of thermal mass, insulation, and geothermal exchange. She unrolled Captain Vance's blueprints and schematics on her kitchen table, and the grizzled, practical men of the prairie leaned in, their faces lit with the fire of a new understanding. Vance's folly was never uttered again. It became known as the Vance House, or more commonly, the Earth Shelter. The name itself was a lesson. That spring, construction in the territory looked different. When a new family broke ground, Silas Croft was there, not just as a builder, but as an evangelist. He convinced them to invest in the foundation, in the gravel, and the waterproofing. He helped them source surplus Quonset huts, and when those weren't available, he designed arched wooden frames that could bear the load of the earth. He became the territory's foremost expert in a technology he had ridiculed only months before. The first few replicas were built under his direct supervision. They weren't all as elegant as Elara's, but they all worked. Families who had spent the previous winter in a state of shivering misery now found themselves in homes that were quiet, stable, and warm. The impact was immediate and profound. The change was visible on the landscape. The sharp, angular lines of traditional cabins were replaced by the soft, rolling contours of earth-sheltered homes, blending into the prairie hills. The vast woodpiles that had been a symbol of wealth and security began to shrink, as the new homes consumed firewood at a fraction of the old rate. The air in the winter was cleaner, with less wood smoke hanging in the valleys. Elara Vance never sought fame or fortune from her innovation. She became a quiet, respected authority. When someone started a new build, they would pay her a visit, and she would share her knowledge freely, offering a cup of coffee and a look at her husband's notebooks. Her reward was not monetary. It was seeing the children of the territory playing on warm floors in the dead of winter. It was knowing that no family would have to burn their furniture to survive the cold. Her husband had fought a war against the elements, and here, on this quiet patch of land, she had won a lasting peace. The real impact wasn't measured in degrees on a thermometer or in cords of wood saved. It was measured in human lives, in the babies who survived their first winters, in the elderly who could live with dignity and without fear of the cold. It was measured in the simple, profound luxury of being able to take off your coat inside your own home in January. Elara Vance hadn't just built a house. She had given her community a blueprint for survival, proving that the most powerful solutions are often found not in fighting nature, but in understanding it. The story of the Earth Shelter is a powerful reminder that conventional wisdom is only wise until it fails. It teaches us that the most profound innovations often come from outsiders, from those who are not bound by the traditions that can blind us to new possibilities. Elara Vance faced mockery and isolation, but she held fast to a truth grounded in empirical knowledge. Her vindication came not from arguing, but from evidence, the undeniable data of a warm room in the heart of a frozen world. The principles she demonstrated in 1947 are more relevant today than ever. The concepts of passive solar design, super insulation, thermal mass, and geothermal heat exchange are the cornerstones of modern sustainable architecture and green building. What was once a radical act of survival on the Montana prairie is now celebrated as cutting-edge engineering. If this story of quiet genius has inspired you, hit that like button to help us share it with others. Subscribe to this channel for more forgotten history and the timeless wisdom it holds. And let us know in the comments, what is the single coldest winter you have ever had to endure? The story you have just heard is a fictionalized account inspired by the real historical principles of earth-sheltered construction and passive solar design used by pioneers and innovators. The specific characters, names, and events were created for narrative purposes. This content is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute professional engineering or construction advice.